A racist police officer named Jake arrests an innocent black man, David, convinced that he has caught another criminal. What Jake doesn't realize is that David is the judge presiding over his ongoing trial. Will justice be served, or is there a lesson Jake has yet to learn? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jake Mitchell's eyes snapped open as the harsh blare of his alarm clock pierced the quiet morning. He lay there for a moment, feeling the weight of the day ahead pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The trial was coming, and he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his stomach. With a deep sigh, Jake swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat up. He rubbed his face, trying to push away the worry that clouded his mind. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated countless times over the past few weeks. As he stood in front of his closet, Jake's hand hesitated over his crisp police uniform. The sight of it usually filled him with pride, but today it felt different. He pulled it on slowly, each button a reminder of the career he'd built, the legacy he was fighting to protect. Straightening his collar in the mirror, Jake's stern face stared back at him. His jaw was set, eyes hard with determination. "They don't understand," he thought. "Someone has to keep order in this town. If I don't do it, who will?" Jake's mind wandered to the incidents that had led to this trial. The traffic stops, the arrests, the confrontations. In his heart, he believed he had done nothing wrong. He was just following protocol, wasn't he? Keeping the streets safe was his duty, and sometimes that meant making tough calls. As he clipped on his badge, Jake felt a surge of defiance. He'd been raised to believe in discipline, in respecting authority. His father and grandfather had worn this same uniform with honor. How could anyone question his methods when they'd been passed down through generations of Mitchell men? Jake grabbed his keys and headed for the door, his steps heavy but purposeful. The world outside seemed hostile now, full of people who didn't understand the pressures of his job. But he wouldn't let them see his doubt. He was Officer Jake Mitchell, and he had a job to do. With one last deep breath, Jake stepped out into the morning sun. His chin was up, his shoulders back. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it head on. He was determined to prove to himself and to everyone else that he was just doing what was necessary to keep the peace. Jake eased his patrol car through the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights, the wealthiest neighborhood in town. The morning sun glinted off perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars parked in circular driveways. His eyes scanned left and right, searching for anything amiss in this picture-perfect scene. As he drove, Jake's mind wandered to the upcoming trial. The allegations against him seemed to echo in his head, growing louder with each passing moment. Racial profiling, they said. Excessive force, they claimed. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "They don't understand," he muttered under his breath. "I'm just doing my job, keeping everyone safe." But even as he tried to convince himself, doubt crept in like a shadow. Jake's heart raced, and he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back despite the cool air conditioning in the car. He slowed the patrol car to a crawl, peering at each house as if the answers to his troubles might be hiding behind the perfectly trimmed hedges. The quiet streets seemed to mock him, their peacefulness a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Jake's thoughts turned to his defense. What would he say in court? How could he make them see that his actions were justified? The more he pondered, the more agitated he became. His leg bounced nervously, and he found himself grinding his teeth. The pressure of the looming trial felt like a weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Jake loosened his collar, trying to shake off the feeling of being trapped. But there was no escaping the reality of his situation. As he turned onto another street lined with massive homes, Jake couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this pristine world. The accusations against him had cast a shadow over everything, even this routine patrol in a quiet neighborhood. As Jake rounded the corner onto Maple Avenue, his eyes locked onto a figure standing outside one of the grandest mansions on the street. It was Black Man on his late 40s on his casual attire. Jake's heart rate instantly picked up. Without pausing to consider the situation, his mind raced with assumptions. What's he doing here? Jake thought, his biases kicking into overdrive. He doesn't look like he belongs. Without a second thought, Jake flipped on his patrol car's lights and pulled over to the curb. His palms grew sweaty as he gripped the steering wheel, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the tension in his body only seemed to increase. Jake swung open the car door and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. He approached the man with quick, aggressive strides, his face set in a stern frown. "Hey, you!" Jake called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" The man turned, surprise evident on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jake cut him off before he could utter a word. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Jake demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He positioned himself with his feet apart, adopting an intimidating stance. The man's expression shifted from surprise to a mix of confusion and concern. He slowly reached into his pocket, maintaining eye contact with Jake. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with preconceived notions. He didn't stop to consider that this man might have a perfectly legitimate reason for being here. All he could see was a potential threat, a suspicion fueled by his deep-seated biases. As the man produced his wallet, Jake's fingers twitched near his holster. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake's aggressive approach had turned what should have been a routine interaction into a potentially volatile situation. David Turner calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it to Jake with a steady hand. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm simply waiting for my driver to pick me up." Jake snatched the ID, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized it. Despite the clear evidence before him, his prejudices clouded his judgment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. "A likely story," Jake scoffed, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What's a man like you doing in this neighborhood?" David took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "I live here, officer. That's my home right behind me." He gestured to the grand mansion Jake had first spotted him in front of. Jake's face twisted in disbelief. He glanced at the house, then back at David, unable to reconcile the information with his preconceived notions. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, his voice rising. "I think you're loitering, causing trouble in this nice neighborhood." As Jake's accusations grew louder, people on the street began to take notice. A jogger slowed her pace, watching the scene unfold with concern. A couple walking their dog stopped in their tracks, the man reaching for his phone. "Sir, I assure you I'm not causing any trouble," David said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm simply waiting for my ride. There's no need for this to escalate." But Jake was beyond listening, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Don't tell me what to do," he shouted, taking a step closer to David. "I know your type, always up to no good, thinking you can outsmart the law." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Several people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Whispers of concern and outrage rippled through the onlookers. David stood his ground, maintaining eye contact with Jake. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I think you're making assumptions based on how I look. I'd be happy to show you more proof of my residence if that would help." Jake's hand tightened on his holster, his body tense with barely contained fury. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he spat. "Well, I've got news for you. I'm not falling for your act." Jake's face contorted with anger as he reached for his handcuffs. "That's it. You're under arrest for loitering and obstructing justice," he growled, ignoring David's calm explanations. David's eyes widened in disbelief, but he remained composed. "Officer, please. This is unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong." Jake roughly grabbed David's arm, spinning him around to cuff his hands behind his back. The metal clinked as it tightened around David's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Jake recited mechanically, his voice laced with disdain. The onlookers gasped and murmured in shock. Some shouted protests, but Jake paid them no mind. He was laser-focused on what he believed was his duty. "Please, sir," David said softly as Jake led him to the patrol car. "This is a mistake. I'm a respected member of this community." Jake scoffed, shoving David into the back seat. "Save it for the judge," he sneered, slamming the door shut. As Jake climbed into the driver's seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard. He felt a twinge of doubt, but quickly pushed it aside. No, he thought. I'm doing my job. I'm protecting this neighborhood. The drive to the station was tense. David sat silently in the back, his face a mask of dignified resignation. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated the streets, his mind racing with justifications for his actions. You people always think you can outsmart the law, Jake muttered, glancing at David in the mirror. Well, not on my watch. David met Jake's eyes in the reflection, his gaze steady and unafraid. Officer, he said calmly, I hope you'll realize soon that you've made a grave error in judgment. Jake's stomach churned at David's words, but he pushed down the feeling. He was preventing a crime, he told himself. He was doing the right thing. Wasn't he? Jake marched David into the police station, his grip firm on the man's arm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Officers and staff looked up from their desks, eyebrows raised at the sight of the well-dressed man in handcuffs. Sit, Jake ordered, pointing to a hard plastic chair near his desk. David complied without a word, his eyes scanning the room calmly. Jake rummaged through his desk drawer, pulling out a form. He slapped it down in front of David, along with a pen. Fill this out, he demanded. We need your contact details in case there's a reported case in the neighborhood. David took a deep breath, his frustration evident in the slight tremor of his hand as he reached for the pen. Officer Mitchell, he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. I assure you, this is unnecessary. I have an important appointment that I'm now late for. Jake crossed his arms, unmoved by David's words. Should have thought of that before you decided to loiter in a wealthy neighborhood, he retorted. David shook his head slightly but began filling out the form. His pen moved swiftly across the paper, his handwriting neat despite his haste. Jake watched him closely, still convinced he had prevented a potential crime. As David neared the end of the form, he glanced at his watch, his brow furrowing with worry. Please, officer, he said, looking up at Jake. I really must go. I have a crucial meeting that I cannot miss. Jake scoffed, taking the completed form from David. Yeah, I'm sure it's real important, he said sarcastically, scanning the information. His eyes widened slightly as he read David's occupation, but he quickly masked his surprise with a scowl. David stood up, straightening his shirt. May I leave now? He asked, his tone polite but strained. Jake hesitated, suddenly unsure of himself. The weight of his actions began to settle on his shoulders, but he stubbornly pushed the feeling aside. Fine, he grunted, gesturing towards the exit. But don't let me catch you hanging around suspicious areas again. David nodded curtly and turned to leave, his posture rigid with barely contained frustration. As he walked away, Jake couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of doubt creeping into his mind. Jake settled into his chair at the police station, the familiar creak of the worn leather seat a small comfort in the bustling room. He pulled out the paperwork for David's arrest, his pen scratching across the form as he filled in the details. To Jake, it was just another day, another incident to file away. That's one more troublemaker off the streets, he muttered to himself, a hint of pride in his voice. He leaned back, stretching his arms above his head, feeling satisfied with his work. As Jake reached for his coffee mug, his eyes caught sight of the calendar on his desk. The date of his court hearing was circled in bold red ink, impossible to ignore. His stomach tightened, and for a moment the confidence he'd been clinging to wavered. What if they don't understand, he thought, his brow furrowing. I'm just doing my job, keeping people safe. The doubt crept in, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets. Jake's mind raced, replaying the incidents that had led to this moment. The accusations of racism, the angry faces of those he'd arrested, the whispers of his colleagues. It all swirled together in a dizzying mix. For a brief moment, Jake allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might be wrong. What if his actions weren't as justified as he believed? What if his methods were causing more harm than good? But as quickly as the doubt had appeared, Jake shook it off. He straightened his back, his jaw set with determination. No, he told himself firmly. I know what I'm doing. I'm protecting people. They'll see that in court. With renewed resolve, Jake turned back to his paperwork, pushing away the nagging feelings of uncertainty. He was a good cop, he assured himself. The trial would prove it. Jake pulled into his driveway, the sun dipping below the horizon. The weight of the day hung heavy on his shoulders as he stepped out of his patrol car. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before heading inside. As he opened the front door, the aroma of dinner wafted through the air, but the usual warmth of home was missing. Sarah, his wife, stood in the kitchen, her face etched with worry. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Jake shrugged off his jacket. Same old, just keeping the streets safe." Sarah's frown deepened. "Jake, we need to talk about the trial." He sighed, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "There's nothing to talk about. I did my job, and the court will see that." "But what if they don't?" Sarah pressed, her eyes pleading. "This could end your career, Jake. Everything we've worked for." Jake cut her off, his voice sharp. "It won't come to that. I know what I'm doing." They ate dinner in tense silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. Sarah kept glancing at Jake, her worry palpable, but he avoided her gaze. After dinner, Jake retreated to the living room, sinking into his armchair. The TV droned on in the background, but his mind was elsewhere. The trial loomed large in his thoughts, a storm cloud on the horizon. He replayed the day's events in his mind. The arrest, the paperwork, the familiar routine of it all. In his heart, Jake believed he was right. He was protecting people, wasn't he? Keeping order in a chaotic world? But Sarah's words echoed in his head, planting seeds of doubt. What if the court didn't see things his way? What if his methods weren't as justified as he thought? Jake shook his head, pushing away the doubts. No, he was right. He had to be. Years of experience couldn't be wrong. As the night wore on, Jake sat in his chair, brooding over the upcoming trial. He was determined to defend himself, to prove that his actions were necessary. The world needed cops like him, he thought. Someone had to make the tough calls. With a sense of grim determination, Jake settled deeper into his chair. He would face this trial head-on, just like he faced everything else in his life. He was ready to defend his methods, his career, his very way of life. The morning of the trial arrived, bringing with it a heavy weight that settled in Jake's stomach. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with shaky hands. His police uniform, usually a source of pride, felt constricting today. "You've got this," he muttered to himself, trying to muster the confidence he usually felt. But doubt lingered at the edges of his mind, unwelcome and persistent. As Jake made his way to the courthouse, memories of past arrests flooded his thoughts. Each one, in his mind, had been justified. He remembered the young black man he'd stopped for, looking suspicious in a white neighborhood. The Hispanic woman he'd questioned harshly about her immigration status during a routine traffic stop. In Jake's view, these actions had been necessary, part of keeping the peace. But now, faced with the prospect of explaining himself in court, Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. He pushed it down, focusing instead on the arguments he'd rehearsed. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade imposing and cold. Jake's steps slowed as he approached, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just another day on the job. This was his career, his reputation on the line. As he climbed the steps, Jake noticed the crowd gathering outside. Some held signs, their messages clear even from a distance. "End police brutality," one read. "Justice for all," proclaimed another. Jake averted his gaze, his jaw clenching. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers in crisp suits hurried past, their briefcases swinging. Jake made his way to the designated courtroom, each step feeling heavier than the last, and the pressure of the trial, which he'd managed to keep at bay until now, crashed over him in a wave. Jake's confident facade began to crack, revealing the fear and uncertainty beneath. As he stood outside the courtroom doors, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Jake entered the courthouse, his lawyer by his side. The click of their shoes echoed in the marble hallway, each step bringing them closer to the moment of truth. Jake's heart raced, but he kept his face stern, determined not to show any weakness. "Remember, stick to the facts," his lawyer whispered, patting Jake's shoulder. Jake nodded, his mind already rehearsing the defense he'd prepared. As they pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, Jake's eyes swept across the room. The benches were filled with spectators, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their stares. He and his lawyer took their seats at the defense table. Jake's fingers drummed nervously on the polished wood, betraying the anxiety he was trying so hard to hide. The air in the room felt thick, charged with tension and expectation. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Jake stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He fixed his eyes on the judge's bench, steeling himself for what was to come. The doors behind the bench opened and Jake held his breath. This was it, the moment that would decide his fate. He squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever judge walked through those doors. But as the figure in the black robe emerged, Jake's confidence crumbled. His eyes widened in shock, and his heart plummeted to his stomach. There, taking his seat behind the bench, was David Turner, the very man Jake had wrongfully arrested just days ago. Jake's mouth went dry and he felt the color drain from his face. How could this be happening? The man he had treated so unfairly, the man he had accused and humiliated, was now in charge of his fate. As Judge Turner's gaze met Jake's, there was no hint of recognition or malice, just the impartial, steady look of a man prepared to uphold the law. Jake's mind raced, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. All his carefully prepared defenses suddenly seemed hollow and inadequate. The courtroom fell silent as Judge David Turner took his place behind the bench. Jake's mouth went dry, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man he had arrested just yesterday was now sitting in judgment over him. Jake's heart pounded in his chest and he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. Judge Turner's face remained impassive as he surveyed the courtroom. His dark eyes swept over the crowd before finally settling on Jake. There was no hint of recognition or anger in his gaze, just the calm, steady look of a professional doing his job. Jake, on the other hand, was a mess of emotions. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the defense table. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt tight and constricted. The carefully prepared speech he had rehearsed now seemed meaningless in the face of this unexpected turn of events. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Turner's deep, steady voice cut through the silence. "Are you ready to proceed?" Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt like he was drowning, struggling to catch his breath. His lawyer nudged him gently, bringing him back to reality. Yes, Your Honor," Jake finally managed to stammer out. As Judge Turner began to speak about the charges, Jake's mind raced. How could this be happening? The man he had treated so unfairly, the man he had accused without cause, now held Jake's fate in his hands. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jake, and for the first time he began to question his actions. And the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was fixed on Jake, watching his reaction to this unexpected turn of events. Jake could feel the weight of their stares, adding to the pressure that threatened to crush him. Meanwhile, Judge Turner continued to conduct the proceedings with a calm and professional demeanor. His voice was steady and authoritative as he addressed the court, showing no sign of the confrontation that had occurred between them just the day before. Judge David Turner cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice calm and measured. "Officer Jake Mitchell, you stand accused of multiple instances of racist behavior in the performance of your duties as a police officer." As David continued to detail the charges, Jake's mind reeled. How could this be happening? Just yesterday he had arrested this man, and now he was presiding over Jake's trial. The courtroom seemed to spin around him as he struggled to focus on the judge's words. "These charges include racial profiling, excessive use of force against minorities, and abuse of power," David continued, his eyes occasionally meeting Jake's. Jake's stomach churned as he realized that David was fully aware of the wrongful arrest from the day before. It wasn't just a coincidence. This was a judge who had experienced Jake's prejudices firsthand. The weight of the situation began to settle on Jake's shoulders, crushing him with its significance. As David spoke, Jake's mind raced through the events of the past day. He remembered the smug satisfaction he had felt when arresting David, the certainty that he was doing his job correctly. Now, those same actions were being laid bare in the courtroom, exposed for what they truly were: acts of prejudice and injustice. Jake's palms began to sweat as he listened to the list of charges. Each one felt like a blow, chipping away at the armor of self-righteousness he had built around himself. He glanced around the courtroom, seeing the faces of those watching him. Some looked angry, others disappointed, but all seemed to be waiting to see how he would respond. The reality of his actions began to sink in. Jake had always justified his behavior as necessary for maintaining order, but hearing it described in the clinical language of the court made it sound so much worse. He felt a creeping sense of shame as he realized how his actions must have appeared to others, especially to those he had targeted. Judge David Turner took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Jake. "I'd like to recount an incident that occurred just yesterday," he began, his voice steady and clear. "This incident serves as a prime example of the behavior that has led to these charges against Officer Mitchell." The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on David as he began to describe the events of the previous day. Jake felt his heart racing as he listened, the memory of his actions fresh in his mind. "Yesterday afternoon, I was standing outside my home waiting for my driver," David explained. "Officer Mitchell approached me without provocation, immediately assuming I was engaged in suspicious activity." As David continued to detail the encounter, Jake's face grew hot with shame. He heard gasps and murmurs from the courtroom as the judge described how Jake had aggressively questioned him, refusing to believe his explanation. "Despite my calm demeanor and honest answers, Officer Mitchell arrested me for loitering and obstructing justice," David said, his voice tinged with sadness rather than anger. "He took me to the station, forced me to fill out unnecessary paperwork, and delayed me from attending to important matters." Jake's eyes darted around the courtroom, seeing looks of disbelief and disappointment on the faces of those present. He felt a knot forming in his stomach as the reality of his actions began to sink in. "This incident," David continued, "is not an isolated event. It is indicative of a pattern of behavior that Officer Mitchell has exhibited throughout his career. His actions are rooted in prejudice and have caused harm to numerous individuals in our community." As David spoke, Jake found himself unable to look away. The judge's calm recounting of events stripped away all of Jake's justifications, leaving him face to face with the truth of his actions. For the first time, he began to see his behavior through the eyes of those he had wronged. The weight of his actions pressed down on Jake, making it difficult to breathe. He had always believed he was just doing his job, maintaining order. But now, hearing his actions described so plainly, he couldn't deny the prejudice that had guided him. As David continued to speak, Jake's lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object to this personal account. It's prejudicial to my client's case," he argued, his voice strained. David turned his calm gaze to the lawyer. "Counselor, I understand your concern. However, this incident is directly relevant to the charges at hand. I will allow myself to continue." His tone was firm but fair, leaving no room for further argument. Jake's lawyer sat down, looking defeated. Jake felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back as David resumed his account. "Officer Mitchell's actions yesterday weren't just a mistake," David explained, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. "They were a manifestation of deeply ingrained biases that have influenced his entire career." David began to methodically present evidence of Jake's past behavior. He cited numerous complaints from community members, statistical data showing a pattern of racial profiling, and testimonies from Jake's fellow officers. "Time and again, Officer Mitchell has demonstrated a tendency to judge individuals based on their race rather than their actions," David said, his words cutting through Jake's remaining defenses. As David spoke, Jake felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had always justified his behavior as necessary for maintaining order, but hearing it laid out so clearly, he couldn't deny the truth anymore. "What we see here," David continued, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and determination, "is not just one incident of poor judgment. It's a systemic problem that has caused harm to countless individuals in our community." The courtroom remained silent, hanging on David's every word. Jake looked around, seeing shock and disappointment on the faces of those present. He felt a deep sense of shame wash over him as he realized the full impact of his actions. David's words painted a picture of a police officer who had lost sight of his duty to protect and serve all members of the community equally. As he systematically dismantled Jake's defense, exposing the flaws in his reasoning and the underlying racism in his actions, Jake felt his justifications crumbling away. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as David concluded his statement. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, leaving everyone, especially Jake, to confront the harsh reality of systemic racism within law enforcement. Jake sat in the courtroom, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. For the first time in his career, he felt exposed and vulnerable. The weight of David's words pressed down on him, crushing the armor of self-righteousness he had worn for so long. As David paused, allowing the gravity of his statement to settle over the room, Jake's mind raced. He began to question everything he thought he knew about himself and his work. The certainty that had driven his actions for years began to crumble. Jake's eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in the shocked faces of those present. He saw disappointment, anger, and sadness reflected in their expressions. It was as if he was seeing himself through their eyes for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. The tension in the room was overwhelming. Jake could feel the eyes of everyone on him, judging him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too restrictive. As the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Jake felt a wave of shame wash over him. He thought about all the people he had wrongly judged, all the lives he might have impacted negatively. The faces of those he had arrested or confronted flashed through his mind, each one a testament to his biases and prejudices. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together on the table in front of him. He realized that his actions hadn't been about maintaining order or doing his job. They had been about power and prejudice, about imposing his narrow worldview on others. The silence in the courtroom seemed to stretch on forever. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked up at David, the man he had wrongfully arrested just yesterday, now sitting in judgment of him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jake, and it only served to deepen his sense of shame and regret. David took a deep breath, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Jake. "Officer Mitchell," David began, his voice clear and steady. "The badge you wear is not just a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of trust, of responsibility, and of justice. But justice isn't about enforcing rules blindly. It's about understanding, empathy, and seeing the humanity in every person we encounter." Jake felt each word like a blow, his certainties crumbling around him. He couldn't look away from David's intense gaze. "The power we hold in our positions comes with a great responsibility," David continued. "We must constantly question our own biases and assumptions. We must strive to see beyond stereotypes and prejudices that cloud our judgment." The courtroom was silent, hanging on David's every word. Jake felt exposed, as if David was speaking directly to his soul. "Officer Mitchell, I challenge you to confront the stereotypes you've held for so long, to question the beliefs that have guided your actions, to see the people you've sworn to protect as individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own worth." Jake's mind raced, memories of past encounters flashing before his eyes. He saw faces he had dismissed, lives he had impacted without a second thought. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "This is not just about you, Officer Mitchell," David said, his voice softening slightly. "This is about the community you serve, about the trust that's been broken, and about the opportunity for change. It's never too late to open your eyes, to learn, to grow." Jake felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Today you stand accused of racist behavior," David continued, "but I see this as more than just a trial. I see it as an invitation to change, to become the officer you swore to be when you first put on that badge." Jake's world had been turned upside down. The man he had wrongfully arrested was now offering him a chance at redemption. He felt overwhelmed, confused, and for the first time in years, truly humbled. David's words hung in the air, their weight palpable in the hushed courtroom. Jake sat frozen, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. He braced himself for the harsh sentence he felt he deserved. But David's next words caught him completely off guard. "Officer Mitchell," David began, his voice firm yet compassionate. "I believe that true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about growth and understanding. With that in mind, I'm sentencing you to 1 year of public service." Jake's eyes widened in surprise. He looked up at David, confusion etched across his face. "You will work with underprivileged youth in our community," David continued. "This isn't a punishment, Officer Mitchell. It's an opportunity. A chance to see beyond your biases and to understand the people you've sworn to protect and serve." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Jake felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He had expected anger, punishment, the end of his career. Instead, he was being offered a chance at redemption. "During this year," David explained, "you'll engage with young people from diverse backgrounds. You'll hear their stories, understand their challenges, and hopefully see the world through their eyes." Jake's mind raced. The thought of working closely with the very people he had misjudged and mistreated filled him with a mix of fear and shame. He realized with a jolt that this would force him to confront the impact of his biases head-on. "This task won't be easy, Officer Mitchell," David said, his gaze steady. "It will challenge you in ways you can't yet imagine, but I believe it's necessary, not just for you, but for our community." As the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in, Jake felt overwhelmed. He had spent years building walls around himself, justifying his actions. Now those walls were crumbling, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The enormity of the task ahead hit Jake like a tidal wave. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, to look into the eyes of those he had wronged. The thought was terrifying, yet somewhere deep inside, a small spark of hope flickered to life. After the trial, Jake stepped through the front door of his home, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the day's events. His wife, Sarah, rushed to greet him, her face etched with worry. "Jake, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You're not going to believe this, Sarah," he said softly. They moved to the living room, settling on the couch. Jake took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the trial. He told her about David Turner being the judge, about the wrongful arrest, and how it had all unfolded in the courtroom. "And then," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "instead of throwing the book at me, he sentenced me to a year of public service. I have to work with underprivileged kids in the community." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Public service? That's unexpected." Jake nodded, still processing it himself. "He said it wasn't a punishment but a chance to grow and understand, to see beyond my biases." Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's going to be tough, Jake. Are you ready for that?" He shook his head, feeling lost. "I don't know, Sarah, I really don't know. All these years I thought I was doing the right thing. But now?" For the first time, Jake felt the stirrings of regret. The faces of those he had wrongly accused or treated harshly flashed through his mind. He remembered the fear in David's eyes when he had arrested him, the confusion and hurt on countless other faces. "I've made so many mistakes," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "How am I supposed to face these kids knowing what I've done?" Sarah moved closer, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "It won't be easy, Jake, but maybe this is a chance to make things right, to be better." Jake leaned into her embrace, feeling both scared and oddly hopeful. The road ahead would be challenging, but perhaps it was time to confront his biases and learn to see the world through different eyes. The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Jake reluctantly got out of bed. It was the day he had been dreading, his first day of community service at the local youth center. He moved slowly, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. As Jake approached the worn-down building, his stomach churned with anxiety. The faded sign reading Oakwood Youth Center loomed before him, a stark reminder of his new reality. He took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy metal door. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Jake's eyes darted around the cramped reception area, taking in the mismatched furniture and peeling paint. A few teenagers lounged on tattered couches, eyeing him suspiciously. "Officer Mitchell," a stern voice called out. Jake turned to see a tall woman with graying hair approaching him, Her face was set in a hard line, her eyes scrutinizing him carefully. "I'm Margaret Thompson, the director," she said, not extending her hand. "I've been briefed on your situation." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to start my community service." Margaret nodded curtly. "Follow me," she said, turning on her heel. As they walked through the narrow hallways, Jake could feel curious eyes following him. The walls were covered with colorful posters and artwork, a stark contrast to the sterile environment he was used to at the police station. Margaret led him to a small office and gestured for him to sit. "Let me be clear, Officer Mitchell," she began, her voice low and serious. "These kids have had enough negative experiences with law enforcement. I won't tolerate any behavior that makes them feel unsafe or unwelcome." Jake nodded, his usual bravado completely absent. "I understand," he said softly. "Good," Margaret replied. "You'll start by helping with our after-school tutoring program. Some of these kids are struggling and they need patience and understanding. Can you handle that?" Jake hesitated, feeling completely out of his depth. His mind raced with doubts. How could he connect with these kids? What if they rejected him outright? The familiar territory of his patrol car seemed a world away. I'll do my best," he finally managed to say. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "That's all we can ask. Remember, Officer Mitchell, this is an opportunity for growth, for you and for these kids." As Jake followed Margaret out of the office, he felt a mix of fear and something else he couldn't quite name. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something important. Margaret led Jake to a brightly lit room where a group of children and teenagers sat around tables, books and papers scattered before them. As they entered, all eyes turned to Jake, and the room fell silent. "Everyone, this is Officer Mitchell," Margaret announced. "He'll be helping with tutoring for the next few months." Jake stood awkwardly, his usual authoritative stance replaced by an uncertain shuffle. He raised a hand in a half-hearted wave. "Hello," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The kids exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. Jake could sense their wariness, and it made him uncomfortable. He was used to people respecting his uniform, not eyeing him with suspicion. Margaret gestured to an empty chair. "Why don't you start by helping Tyrone with his math homework?" Jake nodded and made his way to the table where a young boy sat, hunched over a textbook. As he approached, Tyrone looked up, his eyes widening with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Hi, Tyrone," Jake said, trying to soften his voice. "Mind if I take a look at what you're working on?" Tyrone hesitated before sliding his paper over. Jake glanced at the math problems, realizing with a start that he barely remembered how to solve them. He felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead as he struggled to recall his high school algebra. As Jake fumbled through an explanation, he noticed Tyrone's confused expression. The boy's furrowed brow and fidgeting hands spoke volumes about his discomfort. Jake paused, suddenly aware of the vast gulf between them. Looking around the room, Jake saw other volunteers easily chatting with the kids, creating an atmosphere of trust and openness. He felt like an outsider, his uniform a barrier between him and these young people. As the session continued, Jake found himself doing more listening than talking. He overheard snippets of conversation about struggles at home, difficulties in school, and dreams for the future. Slowly, he began to see these kids not as potential troublemakers, but as individuals with their own stories and challenges. One girl's comment caught his attention. "My brother got stopped by the cops again yesterday," she said to her friend. "He wasn't even doing anything wrong." Jake felt a pang of guilt, remembering countless times he had made similar stops. For the first time, he considered how his actions might have affected families like hers. As the tutoring session came to an end, Jake realized he had barely helped anyone with their homework, but something had shifted inside him. He had begun to see these kids as more than just names on a form or potential suspects. They were real people, with hopes and fears just like anyone else. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself settling into a routine at the youth center. At first, he had dreaded each visit, but gradually something began to change. The faces that had once blurred together started to become distinct, each with its own story. There was Maria, a bright-eyed girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor despite her family's financial struggles. Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations about science and medicine, marveling at her determination. Then there was Darnell, a quiet boy who loved to draw. Jake had initially pegged him as a troublemaker, but soon discovered the sketchbook full of beautiful artwork that Darnell kept hidden away. As Jake learned their names and stories, he began to see the young people in a new light. He realized that each of them carried burdens he had never considered before. Some were caring for younger siblings while their parents worked multiple jobs. Others were struggling to keep up in school while dealing with unstable home lives. One afternoon, Jake arrived at the center to find Tyrone, the boy he had first tried to help with math, sitting alone in the corner. Jake approached him cautiously. "Everything okay, Tyrone?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been weeks ago. Tyrone looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "My dad got arrested last night," he said quietly. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. In the past, he might have assumed Tyrone's father was guilty without a second thought. But now, he found himself wondering about the circumstances, about how this would affect Tyrone and his family. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jake said, sitting down next to the boy. "Do you want to talk about it?" As Tyrone opened up, Jake listened with a newfound empathy. He realized that the world these kids lived in was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Their struggles, their hopes, their fears, all of it was so much more than what he had seen from behind his badge. Jake's next challenge at the youth center came in the form of Marcus, a lanky teenager with a permanent scowl etched on his face. The center's director had pulled Jake aside, explaining that Marcus was their most troubled case, in and out of juvenile detention more times than they could count. "Good luck," the director said, a hint of doubt in his voice. "Marcus doesn't trust easily." Jake approached Marcus, who sat alone at a table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Hey there, Marcus. I'm Jake," he said, trying to keep his voice friendly. Marcus barely glanced up. "Don't care," he muttered. Jake took a deep breath, reminding himself to be patient. "Mind if I sit down?" Marcus shrugged, which Jake took as a reluctant yes. As he lowered himself into the chair, Jake noticed the faded bruises on Marcus's knuckles. In the past, he would have immediately assumed the worst. Now he found himself wondering what battles this kid had been fighting. For days, their interactions followed the same pattern. Jake would try to engage Marcus in conversation, and Marcus would respond with grunts or one-word answers. But Jake didn't give up. He kept showing up day after day, sitting with Marcus even when the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Marcus's answers grew from one word to two, then to full sentences. Jake learned that Marcus loved basketball, but had never played on a real team, that he was good at math but struggled with reading, that he had a little sister he adored but rarely got to see. One afternoon, as they were shooting hoops in the center's small courtyard, Marcus suddenly stopped, the ball clutched tightly in his hands. "Why do you keep trying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone else just gives up on me." Jake felt a pang in his chest. He thought about all the times he had given up on kids like Marcus, labeling them as lost causes. "Because I'm starting to see that everyone deserves a chance," he said softly, "even when they think they don't." Marcus's eyes met Jake's, and for the first time, Jake saw a glimmer of hope there. In that moment, Jake realized how much his past actions had affected kids like Marcus. How many times had he judged someone without knowing their story? How many lives had he impacted without even realizing it? As they resumed their game, Jake felt a shift in his perspective. He wasn't just serving his sentence anymore. He was learning, growing, and maybe, just maybe, making a difference. As the weeks turned into months, Jake's presence at the youth center became a familiar and welcome sight. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle at first, but it didn't go unnoticed by the staff and the young people he worked with. One afternoon, as Jake was helping Marcus with his math homework, Mara, one of the center's longtime volunteers, approached them. She watched for a moment, a small smile playing on her lips as she observed Jake patiently explaining a complex problem. "You know," Mara said, her voice warm, "when you first started here, I wasn't sure how this was going to work out. But I have to say, Jake, you've really proven me wrong." Jake looked up, surprised by the compliment. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling of pride he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thanks, Mara," he said sincerely. "I guess I had a lot to learn." As the days passed, Jake found himself looking forward to his time at the center. The sense of fulfillment he felt when helping these kids was unlike anything he'd experienced in his policing career. He began to see the world through their eyes, understanding the challenges they faced and the strength it took to overcome them. One day, while organizing a community basketball game, Jake overheard two of the center's staff members talking. "Can you believe that's the same guy who started here a few months ago?" one of them said. "He's like a completely different person." "I know," the other replied. "The kids really respond to him. It's like he finally sees them for who they are." Jake paused, letting their words sink in. He realized that he had indeed changed. The biases that had once clouded his judgment were slowly fading away, replaced by a genuine understanding and empathy for the people he now worked with. As he watched the kids laughing and playing on the basketball court, Jake felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He wasn't just serving a sentence anymore, he was making a real difference in these young lives. And in doing so, he was changing his own life for the better. One evening, as Jake was locking up the youth center, he heard a commotion outside. His heart raced as he recognized Marcus's voice among the angry shouts. Jake rushed out to find Marcus surrounded by a group of older teens, the situation teetering on the edge of violence. "What's going on here?" Jake called out, his voice firm but calm. Marcus turned, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. "Jake, they started it." Jake approached slowly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. He could feel the old instincts kicking in, the urge to assert authority and control. But something had changed in him. Instead of barking orders, he took a deep breath and spoke softly. "All right, everyone, let's take a step back and talk this through," Jake said, his gaze moving from face to face. "No one needs to get hurt here." The older teens eyed Jake warily, clearly recognizing him as an authority figure, but it was Jake's calm demeanor that seemed to catch them off guard. "This ain't your business, old man," one of them sneered. Jake nodded, acknowledging the teen's words. "You're right, it's not my fight, but I care about Marcus, and I don't want to see anyone get hurt. Can we talk about what's really going on here?" His words seemed to deflate some of the tension. Jake gently placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him a few steps back. He then turned to the other teens, his expression open and attentive. "What's got you all so worked up?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. As the teens began to explain, Jake listened intently. He didn't interrupt or judge, just nodded and asked clarifying questions. Slowly, the anger in their voices began to fade, replaced by frustration and, Jake realized, a deep-seated hurt. Marcus watched in awe as Jake navigated the conversation, diffusing the situation without a single threat or show of force. It was a side of Jake he'd never seen before, and it left a profound impact on him. As the group began to disperse, tensions now eased. Jake turned to Marcus. The young man's eyes were filled with a new respect and gratitude. "How did you do that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I listened, Marcus. Sometimes that's all people really need." As Jake's transformation continued, the changes in him didn't go unnoticed at home. His wife, Sarah, watched with a mixture of surprise and relief as her husband became more thoughtful, patient, and open-minded. One evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to Jake with a soft smile. "You seem different lately," she said, her voice gentle. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's like you're lighter somehow." Jake nodded, taking a deep breath. "I feel different, Sarah. This whole experience, it's opened my eyes in ways I never expected." Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Tell me about it," she encouraged. Jake's eyes welled up with tears as he began to speak. "I've been so wrong, Sarah. For so long, I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But I was hurting them. I was so blinded by my own biases that I couldn't see the damage I was causing. Sarah listened intently as Jake poured out his heart, describing his experiences at the youth center and the profound impact they had on him. He spoke of Marcus and the other kids, of the challenges they faced and the resilience they showed. "I want to be better, Sarah," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "For you, for our community, for myself. I want to keep learning and growing." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears of her own. "I'm so proud of you, Jake," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "This journey hasn't been easy, but watching you change, seeing you become the man I always knew you could be, it's beautiful." As they held each other, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The path ahead was still long, but with Sarah by his side and his newfound understanding, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the months passed, Jake's role at the youth center evolved. What had started as a court-mandated punishment transformed into a genuine passion. He found himself arriving early and staying late, eager to make a difference in the lives of the young people he now cared for deeply. One sunny afternoon, Jake stood before a group of teenagers, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "All right, team," he said, clapping his hands together. "Who's ready to start our new community garden project?" The kids cheered, their excitement palpable. Jake had proposed the idea to the center's director, seeing it as an opportunity to teach responsibility, teamwork, and the value of nurturing something from seed to harvest. As they worked together, tilling the soil and planting seedlings, Jake felt a warmth in his chest. He watched Marcus, once so resistant to his presence, patiently explaining to a younger boy how to properly space the tomato plants. "You're doing great, Marcus," Jake called out, giving him a thumbs up. Marcus grinned back, a far cry from the scowl he'd worn when they first met. Word of Jake's dedication spread through the community. Parents began approaching him, thanking him for the positive influence he had on their children. Local businesses offered to sponsor some of the center's programs, impressed by Jake's initiatives. One evening, as Jake was locking up the center, he noticed a familiar face approaching. It was David Turner, the judge who had sentenced him to this community service. "Officer Mitchell," David greeted him with a nod. David shook his hand, a small smile playing on his lips. "I've been hearing good things about your work here, Jake. It seems you've found your true calling." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "I have," he admitted. "And I have you to thank for it. You could have thrown the book at me, but instead you gave me a chance to learn and grow. I can't express how grateful I am for that." David's smile widened. "That's all I hoped for, Jake. To see you understand and make amends. Keep up the good work." As David walked away, Jake felt a sense of pride and purpose he'd never experienced before. He wasn't just serving his time, he was making a real difference. And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace with himself and his place in the community. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the youth center, David Turner pulled up in his car. He sat for a moment, observing the bustling activity inside through the large windows. Children and teenagers moved about, engaged in various activities with Jake at the center of it all. David took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. As he approached the entrance, he could feel the tension building in his chest. This was the first time he'd seen Jake since the trial, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Jake was in the middle of helping a young girl with her homework when he noticed David enter. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a mix of gratitude and nervousness wash over him. Excusing himself, Jake made his way over to David. "Judge Turner," Jake greeted him, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "I didn't expect to see you here." David nodded, his expression neutral but his eyes kind. "I wanted to see for myself how things were progressing, Officer Mitchell." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Jake was the first to break the tension. I want to thank you," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did for me, giving me this opportunity instead of a harsher sentence, it's changed my life." David's expression softened. I'm glad to hear that, Jake. That was my hope when I made my decision. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. I never thought I'd say this, but your judgment was exactly what I needed. It opened my eyes to so much that I was blind to before. David smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. I can see the change in you, Jake. The reports I've received about your work here have been impressive. You've taken this opportunity and truly made something of it. Thank you, sir, Jake replied, feeling a sense of pride at David's words. I'm trying my best to make amends and to be a positive influence here. David placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Keep going, Jake. The path you're on now, it's making a real difference. Not just for these kids, but for you too. I can see it. As David Turner left the youth center, Jake found himself lost in thought. He wandered over to a quiet corner of the room, his eyes scanning the vibrant space filled with laughter and chatter. The weight of his journey settled on him, and he felt a lump form in his throat. Jake's mind drifted back to that fateful day when he had arrested David. He remembered the arrogance, the unfounded suspicion, and the bias that had clouded his judgment. The memory made him wince, but it also filled him with a deep sense of gratitude for how far he had come. "Officer Jake!" a young voice called out, pulling him from his reverie. It was Marcus, the troubled teen he had been mentoring. "Can you help me with this math problem?" Jake smiled warmly. "Of course, buddy, let's take a look." As he sat down next to Marcus, Jake realized that true justice wasn't about power or control. It was about empathy, understanding, and serving the community. These kids, with their struggles and dreams, had taught him more about justice than his years on the police force ever had. The realization hit him like a wave. His work here wasn't just a sentence to be served, it was a calling. Jake felt a surge of purpose, stronger than anything he had experienced before. He knew then that he wanted to continue his work at the youth center, even after his mandated time was up. "You know what, Marcus?" Jake said, looking at the young man with newfound clarity. "I think I've found my true calling right here with you guys." Marcus looked up, surprised. "You mean you're gonna stay, even when you don't have to anymore?" Jake nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "That's right. If they'll have me, I'd like to keep helping out here. There's so much more good we can do together." As Jake helped Marcus with his homework, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had started this journey as a punishment, but somewhere along the way, it had become his redemption. And now, it was his future. The community center buzzed with excitement as people gathered for the annual youth showcase. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the air was filled with laughter and chatter. Jake stood near the entrance, his heart swelling with pride as he watched the young people he had mentored over the past year setting up their displays. Marcus approached Jake, grinning from ear to ear. "Officer Jake, can you believe how many people showed up?" Jake chuckled, still getting used to the warmth in the young man's voice. "It's amazing, Marcus. You all deserve this recognition." As the event kicked off, Jake found himself overwhelmed by the transformation he saw in the youth. Kids who had once been withdrawn were now confidently presenting their projects. Teenagers who had struggled with anger were patiently teaching younger children new skills. Midway through the event, the center's director called for everyone's attention. "We have a special recognition to make tonight," she announced, her eyes finding Jake in the crowd. "Officer Jake Mitchell has been an integral part of our center this past year, and his dedication has touched countless lives." Jake felt his cheeks flush as he was ushered to the front. He looked out at the sea of faces, children, teenagers, parents, and community members, all smiling back at him. The weight of the moment hit him, and he felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. Marcus stepped forward, holding a plaque. "On behalf of all of us here, we want to thank you, Officer Jake. You came here as part of a sentence, but you became family. You believed in us when others didn't, and you showed us that change is possible." As Jake accepted the plaque, his hands trembled slightly. He looked down at the inscription, "For outstanding service and dedication to our youth and community." Jake cleared his throat, struggling to find words. I came here thinking I was the one who would be teaching and helping, but the truth is, you all have taught me so much more. You've shown me what real strength, resilience, and community look like. I'm honored to be a part of this family." The room erupted in applause, and Jake found himself engulfed in a group hug initiated by the kids. As he stood there, surrounded by the warmth and love of the community he had grown to cherish, Jake realized that his transformation was complete. He was no longer the biased officer who saw the world in black and white. He was now a mentor, a friend, and a true guardian of his community. One morning, Jake stood outside the courthouse, his heart beating steadily. The building that had once filled him with dread now seemed different, almost welcoming. He took a deep breath and climbed the steps, his footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. Inside, he made his way to Judge David Turner's chambers. As he waited to be called in, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him back here. A year ago, he had entered this building as a different man, arrogant, biased, and blind to his own faults. Now he returned humbled, enlightened, and grateful. "Officer Mitchell," the secretary called. "Judge Turner will see you now." Jake entered the office, his eyes immediately meeting David's. The judge stood up, a warm smile on his face. "Jake," David said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you." Jake shook David's hand firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Your Honor." David gestured for Jake to sit. "Please, call me David. We're not in court today." As they sat down, Jake felt a lump forming in his throat. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, words seemed inadequate. "David," Jake began, his voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to thank you. What you did for me, it changed my life. You could have thrown the book at me, but instead, you gave me a chance to learn and grow." David nodded, his eyes kind. "I'm glad to hear that, Jake, but remember, the change came from within you. You did the hard work." Jake smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The kids at the center, the community, they taught me so much about empathy and understanding. I never realized how narrow my worldview was until I stepped out of my comfort zone. David leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. "That's the power of empathy, Jake. It allows us to see beyond our own experiences and connect with others on a deeper level." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for that lesson. It's changed how I see the world, how I interact with people. I feel like I'm finally serving my community in the way I always should have." David stood up and Jake followed suit. The judge extended his hand once more. "I'm proud of you, Jake. You've shown that change is possible, that we can grow and learn from our mistakes." As they shook hands, Jake felt a sense of closure wash over him. This handshake symbolized more than just a greeting. It was a sign of forgiveness, of growth, and of the incredible power of empathy. If you enjoyed the story of Jake and David, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.